Hello everyone. In this video I'm going to be showing how I modeled, rigged, and animated this base mesh for a robot that can be edited further as you like. This will give you a nice starting point to work off of for editing the robot further, adding more details, and you can see how I did it in this little clip here. In this video I'm just going to be focusing on the modeling of the base mesh, the rigging, and the animation, and I'll save the rendering and compositing for a separate video. I'll be using animations from Mixamo and the free Rococo Studio add-on for retargeting animations. So there's no paid process involved here. So let's get started. Alright, so to start modeling this character, I'm first going to delete the default cube, and I'm going to Shift-A add an armature human meta rig. And this will create this base character for us to base the model off of. And from this character, I'm going to add a mesh UV sphere. And I'm just going to add a few of these to just approximate the shape that I want to get. And then for the arms and legs, I'm just going to do one side for now so I can duplicate and with a mirror modifier, so that it'll be a little easier to modify both sides at the same time. So next, I'm just going to hide this meta rig so it doesn't really get in our way. You can see the base layout of the shape a little better here. So now I'm going to start by making a very simple upper torso section of this robot. And just to keep it simple, I'm going to be using essentially one function here and not overcomplicating things. So for this, I'm going to go into edit mode and go into the front view with numpad 1, switch to orthographic mode with numpad 5, and activate the X-ray with Alt-Z. And then I'm going to select half of the sphere with B and then X to delete that half of the sphere. Then back over here, I'm going to add a mirror modifier. So we get the second half of the sphere back, but we can edit one side at a time. And now I'm going to switch back to object mode, press the question mark or the slash key to get into focus view on just this sphere, tab into edit mode, and then I'm going to go to the side view with 3 on the numpad. And here I'm going to add in some edge loops with Control R. I'm going to put 3 on this face loop that's right next to the center point here, and then 3 again on this other side. And that's Control R to activate this mode, and then use the scroll wheel to select the number of edge loops you want to make. And then I'm going to do the same thing here and here as well. And so now we have more mesh density in this section here. C to activate the circle select, and then I'm going to select this area. And then I'm going to reduce that selection with Control minus on the numpad. And now I'm going to press E to extrude this out. An arbitrary distance, we're not going to keep it here. This is just for temporary purposes. And now I'm going to do press space to bring up the search menu, or you might need to remap your controls for this. And then I'm going to search for to sphere, which Shift-Alt-S is also the key here. And once this is activated, I can move the mouse to bring this whole selection closer to the shape of a sphere. And you can see it doesn't really work too well with this mesh that we've got going here, but if I delete what I have selected currently with just the faces, go back to our side view, we can see we have a circle here. And that will work nicely for the socket for the arm to sit in. So I'm going to switch to edge mode with 2, and then Alt-click on this edge loop here. And you can see if we go into the front view, it's a little wonky. So I'm going to scale in the X direction, that's SX0. And that will flatten this out here for us. And now I'm just going to move this back in to make it a little bit easier to look at, see what the general shape is going to be. And then tab back to object mode. Now I'm going to shade smooth so we can get a little bit better idea of what it's going to look like. And you can see there are some sharp edges on here still. So I'm going to add a subdivision surface modifier and put that to the rendered view. And so you can see it's improved a little bit, but we're still getting these lines in here. And if you'd like these for stylistic purposes, then that's great, but I'll show you how I managed to reduce them a little bit so it's not as noticeable. So you can start by going back into edit mode. While this loop is still selected here, I'm going to switch to vertex mode and do Control I to invert selection. And now I'm going to use the two sphere mode to restore the sphere shape of this mesh. Before we do that though, an important note on this two sphere tool is that it is operating off the same transform pivot point down here as all of your other operators. So for this purpose, we need to switch it to 3D cursor so that we'll be forming it to a sphere around the 3D cursor rather than the individual origin or median point, which is somewhere in the middle here. So we'll do that now. Activate the two sphere tool and move the mouse as far as you can. And you can see it is a very slight difference, but it's still an improvement a little bit. You've got less ridges and more instead these just smooth lines here. But we're going to be deforming this a little further as well, so it will be less noticeable once we have a final shape put together here. If you'd like to make these socket joints larger relative to the full sphere, one way you can do that is go into edit mode and go into side view again and select some additional vertices with box select to give you a larger socket. And then we're going to go and move them in the X direction with GX and delete those faces again. And then you can select this edge and scale in the X direction to 0. And in this case, I'm scaling towards the individual origins. And now once we've done that scaling, we can do Shift-Alt-S again and pull it into a sphere. You can see from the side, it's a little off from a circle since we were a little short on vertices that time. So if you'd like to refine this further, we can just add in some more edge loops. Now we have a new circle here. And for this, it's a lot easier to scale this socket down than it is to scale it up, because you'll get this sort of funnel shape. But I think I like what we have so far. We'll scale it down just a little bit, and then pull it in too, to keep that shape a little better. And then I'm also going to form that two sphere again towards the 3D cursor. Clean that up a little bit. And now to give us a little bit of a reference point for the head and lower torso sections, I'm going to select this top and bottom vertex and delete them. So now we have like a little bit of a socket here as well for where we want to fit those other spheres into. All right, so we can go out of local view by pressing the question mark or slash key again. And next I'm going to work on the lower torso. So we'll go here and press tab. Again, I'm going to use box select to delete this half of the sphere and add back the mirror modifier to make things easier to work with. Now for this, I'm going to do a similar method to the upper torso, except we want these to be angled downwards towards the legs, the hips. So this is a pretty similar method, but it's a little different. So I'll show that now. Go into local view again with question mark. Now I'm going to go into side view with 3 on the numpad. I'm going to press 2 twice to get to a 45 degree, 3 times to get to a 45 degree angle. And now I'm going to select a square region from this view. So there we go. It's a little trickier to see it, but you can get that shape there from that view. And if I try to move this out in any one direction, it's not going to stretch very well. So instead, I'm going to press E to extrude along its normal dimension. And again, same thing as before, delete the faces, switch to, I guess keep it in vertex mode. Select the edge and then Shift-Alt-S. All right, and then remember we have to put it back to individual origins, or median point will also work. And then we can pull it towards a circle. And again, it doesn't really look the best, so I'm going to back up to here before we delete the faces and add in our edge loops. And then go back to that 45 degree view and try to reselect this as best as I can. And then just use the circle with the middle mouse button to deselect areas that are I'm not wanting to delete. Right, and then I can delete those faces again and perform that sphere operation as well. Now for this part, in order to scale this down to be flattened and make a better circle here, I'm going to switch the transformation orientation into normal from global. And now we can scale in the Y direction. I scale that to 0 with the 0 and the num key. And move that along normal Y as well to bring it back up. And there we have our circular socket joint again. Then go out of edit mode and I'll add in, and I'll switch to shade smooth and add in that subdivision surface again. And you can see, so we still have these ridges, so I'm going to perform that same operation. So after doing the 2-sphere again, we get a smoother sphere for the lower torso. And then I'm also just going to go in and scale down these sockets just a little bit. All right, and we go out of local view, and we can see we've got our 2 body segments for the robot complete. Now I'm going to go over to the arms now and make a base mesh for the robot arms. So to do this, I'm going to use 2 of these spheres, and I'm actually going to duplicate this one and bring it down again so we have a reference point for the hand. And I'm going to select this sphere first and then this top sphere and Control J to join them. Now when we go into edit mode, we've got both of these meshes editable as one object. So go to X-ray, I'm going to scale this one towards its individual origin. Scale that one down just a little bit. And now to get this upper arm shape out of for this robot, I'm going to delete vertices on the bottom of this upper sphere. So in X-ray mode, I'm going to go and select about this much of the lower half of this sphere. I'm actually going to deselect this edge loop here so we get a little bit more of this rounded side of the sphere to fit into the shoulder socket joint. And then go back here and delete some of this lower sphere's upper surface. And I'm just going to delete these vertices, go to X-ray, select these 2 front and center vertices, press F to fill, and then hold F to fill in, and we've got a base mesh for our robot arm. And I'll switch that to shade smooth. You can add a subsurf if you like. Now to make this robot's upper arm fit well with its lower arm, I'm now going to go into edit mode again and go to the front view, and I'm going to select this entire lower sphere here and press P for separate, just selection. And now we'll go out here and go into edit this new object here. Now to fit this sphere back into the socket of this upper arm, I'm going to select this middle edge loop with Alt select. And you can tell this is the middle since the edges increase on one side and decrease on the other. And I'm going to Shift S to bring the cursor to the selected. I'm going to select all, switch to 3D cursor, and Control M to mirror on the Z axis. And then Shift D to duplicate, Control M to mirror on the Z axis. And we've got our sphere back on top. And then I'm going to select all, and then use merge by distance to delete those extra vertices. And if you get this strange shading result, just do Shift N to recalculate normals, and that should get rid of it. So now we can repeat the same process as we used to make the upper arm to make the lower arm by selecting this lower sphere and this upper sphere and Control J to join them. Now we can go into edit mode, and I'm going to scale this one down just a little bit. And so now I'm going to go up on this top sphere and select these lower vertices and delete them. Select some vertices down here the same way, delete those as well. And now I'll do that same fill operation. And there we have it. There's our lower robot arm base mesh. Before we move on, I'm going to make one more adjustment to this lower arm object. I'm going to keep the 3D cursor at this location, which again is the center of this edge loop, and set origin to the 3D cursor. So now it's a little easier for us to rotate the object about its individual origin, which is the elbow. And one final thing, I'm also going to parent this lower arm to the upper arm so that we can just move the upper arm around and not have to worry about keeping the lower arm in the synced location with the socket. So now what I'm going to do for the legs is duplicate both of these arm segments and use them as base meshes for the leg. Although instead of using Shift D to duplicate, I'm going to use Alt D instead, which will create a linked duplicate. And so with a linked duplicate, anytime you edit one of the meshes, any other linked meshes will have that edit affect them as well. So this way we can make adjustments to the shape of the arm and leg at the same time. I'll show you how to undo this in just a second as well, since we'll want the legs to be a different final shape from the arms. I'm going to actually scale this lower torso down slightly. I'm going to delete these placeholder spheres. So now at this point, to start fitting the limbs of the robot together with the body, I'm going to actually work on the scale of these parts a little bit so that they can actually fit together into the robot without intersecting each other. So this is a bit more of an artistic step, but feel free to make these adjustments as you see fit. Another tip for editing the shape of these objects is if you would like to pull in or out these sockets while keeping the shape of the mesh a little more consistent, you can activate this proportional editing or press the O key. And now you can see when I move this area with a appropriately sized area of effect determined by the scroll wheel, you can pull the rest of the mesh along with it in a more smooth manner. So in this case, I'm going to pull it out along the X direction and bring with a little bit more with it. And then I'm just going to go in and adjust the location of these arms and legs to fit together a little more cleanly. Alright, so now I'd like to make these legs a little bit longer so they're not so disproportionate to the upper arms. And again, this is an artistic choice, but in any case, for later on, we're going to want to make these separate from this upper arm objects. So as it is, if I try to edit the shape of the leg, it's also going to affect the arm as well. So to fix this, we're going to select both of these leg segments and choose Make Single User and choose Object and Data. So this will affect the mesh data as well as the object. And now you can see we can go in and edit these, and it doesn't affect the arm shape as well. So now we can go in and make any adjustments here as we like. And note, since that I moved this need section down, I'm going to select this edge loop again, cursor to select it, and go to origin to 3D cursor. So we can keep that origin point at the knee location. I think I'm also going to edit the arms as well to make them a little bit more proportional with the legs. But again, this is just personal preference. All right, and for one more part here, I'm going to edit this leg again. I'm going to edit this lower leg and select the lower half of the sphere below that center line. And I'm going to Shift D to duplicate and press P to separate that selection. I'm going to edit that object. Press E to extrude just a little bit and then scale it up. And now scale it in Z to 0 and extrude once more downwards a bit. And go back to object mode, add a subdivision modifier. Just switch it to shade smooth if it's not already. And we have a basic foot mesh for the robot. So one more thing before we go in and working on mirroring parts here is I'm going to make a couple more adjustments to the arm. All right, so you can see now we have a very long-limbed robot base mesh here. And finally, I can go in and add a mirror modifier to this arm. And for the mirror object, I'm going to set it to the central torso sphere. And then just to keep it simple, I'm going to select the other objects that need that modifier and select that arm and then Control L and copy modifiers. Of course, this head sphere down a little bit so it fits in there with the rest of the body. Now we have a very simple base mesh to work off of for additional parts of the modifications of the robot. So there's other adjustments you can make to this as you like. Again, this is a really artistic step here at this point, but a couple things would be if you want to change the shape of these objects, of the torso objects, so they're less spherical. One way to do that is to select these torso objects, go into edit mode, and we'll go to the front view, X-ray, and just select some of these front faces here And we'll enable proportional editing, and in this case I'm using inverse square about the median point, and S and Y to scale the inwards a little bit. It's a little easier to see the shape in non-X-ray view. So the trick here is, if you want to preserve the shape of the shoulder socket, you just have to scroll on the scroll wheel until the shoulder socket ring is outside this circle of proportional editing. And another thing, if you'd like to edit the shape of either of these torso meshes, a trick to make that a little easier is when you go into edit mode, enable clipping in the mirror modifier, and this will prevent your vertices in the center line from crossing the center line, so you don't get overlapping mesh data there. So now I've got a very simple base mesh put together for the robot here. Next step will be to set it up with that meta rig that we generated earlier, and linking the robot limb segments to the bones of the meta rig for animation. So before we get to the actual rigging part, I'm just going to rename these sphere objects and put them into a collection so we know which is which, and it makes it easier to toggle visibility for objects. Alright, so since this is a fairly simple base mesh, you don't necessarily need this meta rig to go off of. However, I'll show you how I use the meta rig to rig this robot, just so that if you have a more complex base mesh, you can do the same thing as I'm showing here. Alright, so for this, I'm going to select my base mesh objects and go to front view and bring them up to approximately on the 0. And I'm going to the meta rig and scale this up till it's, again, approximately the same size as the robot. Again, this is all approximate here, so since we'll be editing this anyways. And now I'm going to go into edit mode on the meta rig and go into X-ray so it's a little easier to see here. Before I do anything else, I'm going to go down here and enable mirroring on the X dimension so that we can more easily modify both sides of the rig at the same time. And so since this robot is made using ball and socket joints, in order to keep the rotation smooth on each of these, I'm going to do a back and forth method using the 3D cursor. If you have a more organic shape, this isn't as strictly necessary, but it works pretty nicely when you have a lot of ball and socket joints, so I'll show that here. So first I'm going to go to select the upper leg and then cursor to selected. Now go back to the meta rig and select just this upper part of the bone and selection to cursor. And I'll repeat that process for the knee and likewise for the foot. And now since we have such a simple foot, these lowest two bones on the toe and heel don't necessarily need to be included in the rig, but just for consistency or in case you have a more complex rig that you're working with, I'm just going to move them in the X direction up to approximately the location of the ankle bone. Now we can see we have a bone system that matches up exactly with the shape of the legs. Now for the torso, since this robot is so simple, it's only going to require a couple bones for the body of the robot. If you have a more complex robot body, your rig will be a little bit more complex as well. So this really only affects how accurately the robot can follow the motion of a human-based animation. So for the simple 2-segment robot body, I'm going to go in and repeat this process again, and actually going to delete these extra bones that we don't need. And instead of deleting these middle segments, what I'm going to do is select only this bone, press X, and dissolve bones instead. So now we can do that same action as before. And for this middle segment here, I actually want this bone location to be on this rotation point. And so to do this, I'll select the upper torso and select these two central vertices, both of them, not just the one in the front, and cursor to selected. Now we go back to the meta rig, and you can do this same option again. And now we have that bone joint at the exact location of the rotation. And again, I'm going to delete these unnecessary bones. And I'm also going to move the neck location to this point. And now with the head of the robot, with this simple system with no neck and no face, I'm just going to go ahead and delete these face bones. If you do want to do face animation, there's a lot more complicated subject. So for now, I'm just going to keep it simple and delete these as well as the ears. And I'm also going to select this neck bone and dissolve this one as well. And actually, since we have such a simple neck here, I'm actually just going to delete this upper bone and select this neck joint here and press E to extrude, Z to set it in the Z direction. And you can put it approximately at the center there. That actually might be the center, but just to be safe, yeah, so you can see it's at that point. Or you can do the same process again to make sure. All right, and lastly, they have the arm bones. And for these wrist location down here, I'm just going to do the same thing with the edge loop. And again, since this is such a simple robot mesh, we can just delete all these extra bones if we don't have any actual hands. However, since this is a pretty ineffective robot design, if you do want to add any additional hand objects or end effectors, you can just select this joint in the meta rig and press E to extrude and bring it in the Z direction, or however you like. And do the same process for any sort of end effector that you might have. And one quick adjustment here, I'm going to select this bone and change this roll to 0. And really I should do that for all of these. And this will prevent any issues we have with animation in the future. All right, so one last step. Now that we have this rig lined up exactly with our character, we can go in and parent each of the robot parts to its corresponding bone in the meta rig. So before we do this, we still have to worry about this mirror option going on here. And so to do that, I'm going to select all of our base mesh objects and I'm going to apply my modifiers on everything all at once. So now I can select all of these mirrored parts, go into edit mode and X-ray and select this entire half of the robot. Press P to separate the selection. And now we have individual objects for both sides of the robot. We still need to change the origin of each of these parts so that they'll rotate correctly. So we'll do that again, just as before. All right, so now that we have our mirrored objects with their correct origin locations, we can start parenting the robot parts to their corresponding bones. Before you start parenting the robot parts to the bones themselves, apply the scale on your meta rig. So this is just select the meta rig and Control A, apply scale. If you don't have your robot rig scaled to 1, when you start animating, this will cause a lot of issues with the locations of the bones. So make sure to do this before you start parenting robot parts to bones. Otherwise, you'll have to unparent everything and reparent it again, which takes quite a bit of time. So again, scale your robot rig before you start parenting parts to bones. So to do this, I'll first select the meta rig and press Control Tab to go into pose mode. So once we're here, I'll do Alt Z to switch to X-ray view and select this upper arm bone. Now we go out of pose mode with Control Tab again. Now select this upper arm and now Control select the meta rig and go back into pose mode with Control Tab. And now we still have the arm selected as well as this upper arm bone. So we can do Control P and then set parent to bone. And now you'll see if we rotate this bone, currently it's rotating about the 3D cursor. If we rotate this bone, it's moving the upper arm with it. So this is the process we're going to use to rig all the rest of the parts of the robot. So we just repeat this process for each part. And then for the foot bones, since there's some extra bones in the meta rig, we don't need to use all of these, but just to keep it working with the animations that we'll be using, I'm going to select this toe bone to parent the foot object to. The quick correction here, we actually want to parent to the foot bone rather than the toe. So now if we go into pose mode, you can see that when we rotate or move any part of our robot rig, the corresponding part of the robot will move with it. If we go into pose mode and move the leg, you can see that it's not quite moving, it's not quite rotating perfectly in the socket. And the reason for that is that the knee joint is offset from the actual location of the knee just slightly. So if you do want to, it's pretty minor, so if you do want to fix this, you can go into edit mode and select this edge loop again, put the cursor to that location, then go to the mesh, then go to the meta rig, and select this joint, selection to cursor. And after you do this, you'll need to reparent the leg to the bone. But once you do that, you can see that it rotates more perfectly throughout the socket joint. So to animate this robot, I'm going to just use a simple animation downloaded from Mixamo. It's got a ton of great animations to work with. So for the render I made, I used this old man idle animation, and I adjusted the settings on it a little bit just so that it doesn't interfere with the shape of the robot so much. So I'm just going to be using this animation as an example, but feel free to animate it however you like. And then we can download it without the skin and at whichever frame rate you'd like. Although if you use the frame rate that you'd like to render your project at, it'll keep things a little simpler. And keyframe reduction isn't really essential for a simple animation like this. However, if you have a lot more motion in your animation, this might be worth using one of these options. So go ahead and click download. And there we go. So now we'll go back over to Blender and under File, choose Import FBX. And I'm not sure that my recording software is going to capture this window, but all you need to do is select your downloaded file and without changing any settings, click on Import FBX. And Mixamo has them set up properly so that you won't have to worry about any settings when you import. But you can see it came in just fine, and we can play the animation as it is. Can scale it up a little bit. So this next step will be retargeting this animation from the Mixamo rig to the robot rig. And for this, there are a number of ways to do this, but I'm going to be using the Rococo Studio plugin, which is a free add-on that is from Rococo. It's used to work with their motion capture suits, but it also has support for retargeting. So simple enough, we just select under source, we select our armature, and as target, we select the meta rig. Click build bone list, and it should work pretty simply since this is Mixamo and Blender's meta rig. They work together pretty nicely. We've built the bones list, and we'll click retarget animation. And you can see it's sort of working, not entirely, however. And so when we animate this, you can see that the robot legs and torso are approximately following the motion of the animation, but the arms are not. And this is due to the rest position of the rig. So if I select the meta rig and put it in rest position, it'll show exactly how we had it when we were editing the robot, just standing up straight. But if we select this animation, the armature for the animation, and click on its rest position, it is in T-pose. And since the arm positions are different in rest position, which is what it's working off of here with the default settings, the animated arms are getting shifted in approximately 90 degrees. So to fix this, we'll actually just undo that retargeting and go into our pose mode on our rig. And we can actually enable the mirror here as well. We'll rotate about Y, negative 90 degrees to put it into T-pose. And then we will select all with A, which really, it would really only need to select the arms, but just for future, but for more advanced robots, select everything, and then apply selected as rest pose. So now our rest position is in T-pose, similarly to our armature from the animation. So now if we click retarget again, you can see that we get a closer match to the animation from the armature. Now, due to the different proportions of the robot body to the human body used in this armature, the animation won't be followed exactly, and this is just a result of the shape of the robot itself. If you'd like to fix this, you can edit the shape of the robot and make it more closely fit with the armature. So you can see the width of the shoulders is much greater in the robot, and same with the hips. And this extra space affects how closely the retargeting can match the animation. If you do have an add-on like AutoRig Pro, it does have some ways of solving this problem, but for this tutorial I'm just going to be working with free add-ons. And since this is such a simple robot, it's still accurate enough to the animation that it should be usable as is. So now that we have the animation working, we can start making a few tweaks to clean up the motion. One of which would be that you can see when the robot is moving its neck and upper body around, it's actually not staying in that socket joint. And that's since the original animation didn't account for that robot only having limited degrees of freedom in those joints. So it's a pretty minor adjustment, but if you would like to make this change, you can go into pose mode on the armature, on the rig, and add a bone constraint to limit rotation. As you can see, by enabling different axes, the robot's motion will be limited. And make sure to set it to local space as well. So now you see if we press R, we can try to rotate the bone, but it will only move across its one rotation axis of rotation. Likewise with this bone, we can add that same limit rotation in local space. And now you can see that the robot is moving with the joints fitting into the ball and socket system more accurately. Another adjustment we could make is you can see on the arms here that the lower arm is actually bending further than we initially set up the mesh to allow. So if you'd like to fix this, you can go into pose mode and select this bone again and do another limit rotation. Only this time, we'll also set it in local space. And you can adjust this to limit the bone to only rotate about, say, the x-axis, the local x-axis if you like. But to fix that clipping issue, we'll go and set the minimum and the maximum. And this will constrain the robot's arm rotation to fit into the allowable range based on the mesh. And we can repeat that process for the other arm. Another thing you might notice is that with the current animation, as I have it set up, the robot's legs are lifting off the ground. So the reason for this is because the root bone of the armature for the animation and the meta rig are not the same in this current animation retargeting setup. And if you go into the animation armature, you can see that this hip bone is not currently mapping to the correct spine bone here. So we just need to change that in this bone list option so that this spine bone is matching up with this hip bone. And then we can retarget animation. And so it's still lifting up a little bit, but it's definitely reduced. So with that, we have a base mesh for a robot that can be edited further as you like. And that base mesh is rigged so that you can animate it however you like. I may also do another video to show how I did the rendering and compositing process for my robot, if there's enough interest in that. But for now, thank you for watching. I hope this was useful and hope it made sense. If you have any questions or comments, you can leave a comment down below. I'll try to answer as many questions as I'm able to. So if you'd like to see the video of how I did the rendering and compositing of my robot, feel free to subscribe and you'll be notified when that video comes out. And thank you again for watching.